They called it folklore, nothing more than shadow and whisper in the margins of American mysticism. But when that sealed drawer in room 5 finally surrendered after 78 years of stubborn silence, what emerged wasn't myth at all. It was a reel-to-reel magnetic tape labeled in careful script, "Private transmission for future science only, 1944. The ink had faded, but the intention remained crystal clear, waiting like a message in a bottle cast into the ocean of time. The archivist's hands trembled as she pried open that warped wooden drawer, swollen from decades of coastal humidity and painted over so many times it had become a tomb unto itself. During the 2023 renovations of the original ARE headquarters in Virginia Beach, they expected nothing more than forgotten correspondence, perhaps yellowed photographs or dusty ledgers. Instead, they found something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the man history remembers as the sleeping prophet. Alongside a sealed letter and his fountain pen lay that carefully wound spool of tape, unmarked beyond that single chilling inscription. When they played it just once in the sterile quiet of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, even the most hardened skeptics fell silent. This wasn't Edgar Cayce in his famous trance state, eyes closed and voice distant as he channeled wisdom from some unknowable realm. This was Cayce awake, lucid, devastatingly precise, speaking to a future he believed would only arrive after materialism had failed to explain the deepest mysteries of human existence. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen beyond the veil and returned with blueprints for a science not yet born. Born in 1877, Edgar Cayce conducted over 14,000 documented psychic readings, most while lost in self-induced trances that seemed to transport him to dimensions beyond ordinary perception. But beneath the folklore and spiritual speculation lived something more profound. A deeply curious, rigorously observant man who believed science would one day validate what he glimpsed only through intuition. He wasn't some carnival mystic performing tricks for the credulous. He advised doctors and physicists, consulted with military personnel during World War I and the 1918 flu pandemic. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, founded in 1931, stands as his monument to systematizing the unexplained. What history forgot is that Cayce spent his final 2 years not predicting the future, but studying wave theory, early signal detection, and what he termed the field of remembrance, a universal memory matrix that modern theorists might recognize as an information field. In an unmailed letter to physicist Paul Davies, discovered alongside the tape, he wrote with startling clarity, "Consciousness is not confined to the brain. It is patterned energy, vibrating in fields, and the soul is that which remembers across dimensions of time." On this recording, his voice emerges worn but steady, carrying the authority of a dying man who refuses to let vital knowledge perish with him. He doesn't beg to be believed or predict catastrophe. Instead, he speaks as someone who has glimpsed a truth that science has missed, not through mystical revelation but through rigorous observation. He references real researchers of his era, drawing startling parallels between the work of Nikola Tesla, Carl Pribram, and Max Planck and his own trance state experiences. He quotes electromagnetic resonance studies, discusses standing wave interference patterns, and even revisits the Michelson-Morley ether drift experiment, not as failed science but as misinterpreted evidence for non-material fields that surround and penetrate everything we know. Most unsettling is how Cayce seems to describe quantum coherence decades before the term entered scientific vocabulary. He speaks of entangled fields of soul memory, suggesting that a person's spiritual frequency might persist like radio waves beyond the collapse of biological systems. Death, he proposes, is not an ending but a shift in carrier wave, a change in tuning rather than silence. Identity itself, he argues, is not stored but tuned, like a radio finding its frequency in the vast electromagnetic spectrum of existence. Throughout the recording, Cayce returns obsessively to the metaphor of the body as receiver rather than generator. He describes the pineal gland as a transducer, not in mystical terms but bioelectrically, citing studies from Columbia University on low-frequency field resonance in the brain, research that wouldn't gain acceptance in neuroscience for decades. When researchers at UVA later matched concepts from his tape to discoveries in quantum biology and electromagnetic theory, they found patterns too consistent for coincidence, though they stopped short of calling it evidence. The room where this recording was made reveals his methodical approach. His cramped study, lined with thick notebooks, anatomical drawings, and physics texts dated between 1936 and 1944, bears the marks of systematic investigation. Grooves etched into his desk resemble antenna diagrams and planetary orbital patterns, suggesting he wasn't improvising spiritual insights, but constructing a scientific model that merged mind, memory, matter, and meaning into a unified theory of existence. By the time of this recording, Cayce was visibly failing. Multiple small strokes had left him exhausted, and doctors had warned him to cease all readings. But he continued, driven by something beyond personal endurance. This tape may well represent his final intentional act, a last attempt to plant seeds in soil that wouldn't be ready for harvest for nearly a century. His final claim proves most provocative. Under specific electromagnetic conditions, particularly in natural environments with high quartz content or geomagnetic anomalies, souls might become perceptible as persistent information echoes, capable of interacting with certain forms of human consciousness, not as ghosts or visions, but as detectable signal phenomena. He references cave sites in the Appalachians, abandoned hospitals in Europe, and desert plateaus in the American Southwest, places science now confirms possess unique electromagnetic profiles. This isn't spiritualism wrapped in scientific language. This is signal theory applied to the deepest questions of human existence. In the final 40 seconds, his voice transforms, slowing to a whisper that seems to echo across decades. They'll call it death, but it's tuning, all of it. And if they forget the soul in their science, they'll forget themselves. That sentence was looped, intentionally repeated, as if he knew it wouldn't be heard until science was finally ready. Until we were prepared. The recording continues, and what emerges from the static is not the voice of a mystic or prophet, but something far more unsettling, the measured cadence of a scientist describing an impossible discovery. Gone are the flowery proclamations of his legendary trance sessions. What remains is the distilled essence of a man who has glimpsed something beyond the veil of human understanding, and who knows his time to share it is running out. "I will not be here much longer," he says with startling clarity, "but there are things I must say, not to those who believe in me, but to those who believe only in what can be measured." For decades, he had entered altered states of consciousness, providing readings that seemed to tap into knowledge beyond his education or experience. But now, in these final recordings, he strips away the mysticism and reveals what he believes was actually happening, a bioelectric alignment between his nervous system and what he calls the Akashic pattern. This is not a metaphor, he insists, but a frequency field containing the echoes of identity, intention, and emotion. In today's language, it resembles what quantum physicists might describe as an information substrate, a realm where data exists not as physical matter, but as modulations in the very fabric of energy itself. Then comes the revelation that reshapes everything we think we know about consciousness. What you call consciousness is not generated by the brain. The brain is a lens, a local tuner, calibrated to an individual amplitude of experience. But the signal itself, the signal is not born here. Drawing from the pioneering work of Hans Berger, the German psychiatrist who first measured brainwaves in the 1930s, he describes the brain's operation in terms that wouldn't become commonplace for decades. The different EEG states, alpha, beta, delta, are not merely internal conditions, he argues, but resonant gateways allowing limited interaction with vast consciousness fields that exist beyond the boundary of individual minds. Death, he explains with chilling precision, is simply the disbanding of biological constraints. The signal continues, diffused into a slower medium, but still detectable under the right modulation. His understanding had been shaped by correspondence with some of the era's most brilliant minds, particularly Nikola Tesla. He speaks of a lost letter from 1942, in which Tesla hinted at longitudinal waves in consciousness, non-Hertzian fields that could carry information beyond the limitations of conventional electromagnetic theory. Through Tesla's assistance, he learned of secret experiments conducted in New York laboratories, involving copper coils, oscilloscopes, and isolation chambers designed to detect biofield disruptions during meditation, coma, and near-death states. These were among humanity's first crude attempts to measure consciousness itself, and what they discovered was both profound and terrifying. All systems in nature tend toward resonance, he continues, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Death is a shift in natural resonance, what you might call a phase change. The field persists, but its boundary conditions dissolve. The tape hisses in the silence that follows, as if the recording equipment itself is struggling to process the implications of what's being said. When he speaks again, his challenge is direct and uncompromising. Ask your physicist to explain why memory can emerge in people whose brains are damaged beyond retrieval. Ask them why, in moments of near death, the self appears to observe from outside the body. This is not a hallucination. This is signal decoupling. He had collected case studies from battlefield hospitals, hospice wards, and submarine crews suffering oxygen deprivation, documentation of patients describing out-of-body experiences with startling consistency and detail. Rather than dismissing these as the brain's final fantasies, he connected them to diminished cortical gating, theorizing that when the body's electromagnetic homeostasis breaks down, individual consciousness is no longer isolated but becomes networked with something vastly larger. Every soul, he claims, possesses a signature frequency, subtle, layered, modulated across dimensions that conventional science has yet to acknowledge. This isn't mysticism cloaked in scientific language, but literal electromagnetics operating on scales we've barely begun to comprehend. The human brain, he argues, is a fractal receiver optimized through millions of years of evolution, its very structure designed to interface with fields of consciousness that permeate reality itself. He references the ancient chamber tombs of Malta in Egypt, suggesting their precise acoustics and mineral compositions were engineered to induce frequency shifts in human consciousness, creating portals for communication with realms beyond physical death. We are not alone in this field, he declares, not even in our individuality, memory, emotion, love. They are field effects. They leave an imprint in the fabric of reality itself, and like any signal, they can be found again, given the proper phase lock. Here the recording takes a darker turn as he describes classified wartime experiments conducted with naval intelligence and the Office of Strategic Services. Magnetic shielding was tested to block emotional resonance in interrogation subjects, and what researchers discovered was that disrupting the body's natural field didn't just affect psychology, it created metaphysical fracture. The results were so disturbing, so fundamentally challenging to our understanding of human nature, that the findings were buried in classified archives. The most chilling revelation comes from his personal journal, dated July 13, 1943. He describes an experiment conducted on himself using copper coils and quartz crystals embedded within a Faraday cage. What happened next defies rational explanation. He experienced what he calls soul displacement, encountering what appeared to be another version of himself existing in a parallel timeline. While acknowledging this could have been an elaborate hallucination, the physical measurements were undeniable. His pulse vanished, his body temperature dropped 6 degrees, and a magnetic compass inside the cage fluctuated wildly throughout the experience. "I don't claim to understand this," he whispers, his voice carrying the tremor of a man who has touched something beyond human comprehension, only that it was real, and it changed me forever. In his final moments on the recording, exhaustion evident in every word, he returns to the central metaphor that frames his entire theory. We think the music stops because the instrument breaks, but we've forgotten the air still vibrates. His voice cracks as he makes one last desperate plea, not to believers or mystics, but to the physicists, biologists, and engineers who will inherit humanity's future. They will one day detect the soul, he prophesies, not through telescopes pointed at distant stars or through theological debate, but through interference patterns, signal persistence, and quantum coherence decay. You will not believe it when you find it, he says with heartbreaking certainty. You will call it experimental error. You will recalibrate your equipment, adjust your parameters, and dismiss your readings. But eventually the pattern will remain constant, undeniable, staring back at you from your instruments. And you will have to ask the question that will change everything. What lives in this field, beyond death, that still remembers who we are? And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, broken by the weight of cosmic loneliness and infinite possibility, find the signal, not to prove survival, but to remember what life actually is. The tape ends with a soft click, leaving only silence and the profound question of whether we are alone in a universe of dead matter, or part of something far more magnificent and eternal than we have ever dared to imagine. The reel went silent, but its echo did not. What was left behind on that tape was not a prophecy, not a sermon, it was a map. An unfinished, fractal outline, pointing towards something terrifyingly profound. Something almost no one in the scientific world, then or now, is prepared to confront. That identity, consciousness itself, might not end with biological death. It might just change frequency. In the final section of the recording, the tone turns reflective, philosophical, yet painfully grounded. There is no comfort offered here, only challenge. If this field is real, the voice begins, then it changes nothing about death and everything about life. For if consciousness persists, then we must ask, what do we take with us? What do we leave behind? And what is the burden of knowing? The voice references the work of physicist Max Planck, who once stated, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. This insight is seized upon, transformed. The proposal is made that Planck's words were not philosophical, but structural. That the reason consciousness appears to resist full measurement is because it doesn't emerge from matter. It precedes it. Then comes what may be the most unsettling thesis of the entire recording. Materialism is a convenient myth, useful for building bridges, but blind to meaning. We have mistaken the tools of science for the territory of reality, and in so doing, we have amputated the soul from the observable universe. Each word is weighted, deliberate. If I am right, and I do not say that I am, then death is not annihilation. It is diffusion. The self disperses across dimensional boundaries not yet mapped, but glimpsed, in dream, in trauma, in the silent spaces of deep meditation. This is not vague speculation. Specific phenomena are names that science continues to study, but cannot fully explain. Terminal lucidity in dementia patients, verified shared death experiences, people who accurately report events while flatlined, brain dead, or anesthetized. No claims of proof are made. Instead, a pattern is identified, pointing to a signal too coherent, too consistent to dismiss. And then, perhaps the most haunting line of all. If this recording is ever heard, it means you are ready, not to believe, but to measure differently. To listen not just for sound, but for signal in silence. The voice speaks directly to future scientists, warning of the seduction of certainty, reminding them that science is not dogma, but disciplined doubt, that true science evolves when it is willing to be wrong in the right direction. The mind is a function, the voice continues, but the soul is a memory field, one that may not be stored in tissue, but impressed into the substructure of reality itself. This is why children remember lives they were not taught, why dying men speak to mothers long buried, why the body's death does not end the story. Examples are cited from case files. Children who recalled precise historical details they'd never been exposed to, patients who reported visions of the dead during surgeries, soldiers who claimed to be guided by fallen comrades in the battlefield fog. None of it is presented as proof. But all of it, the voice insists, is data, ignored not because it lacks validity, but because it lacks a framework within our existing models. Then, in what may be the most critical moment of the tape, what must come next is outlined. You must build instruments, not to see ghosts, but to detect identity echoes. Instruments that do not just measure amplitude, but also memory resonance. Devices that search for pattern signal retention in post-biological fields. It will take time. It will take courage. But it will happen. The kind of research imagined is described. Scanning recently deceased bodies for electromagnetic fluctuations beyond expected decay, mapping the field geometry of high-emotion sites, battlefields, hospitals, sacred places, for residual frequency patterns. Systems are proposed, artificial intelligence-like constructs, to scan voice recordings for soul print resonance, a hypothetical fingerprint in the signal that could remain unique even across multiple lifetimes. The metaphor of tuning returns. Your body is a string, your soul is the vibration, and the afterlife is not a place, it is a modulation, a shift. The echo continues. There is no request to believe in reincarnation, or heaven, or spirits. Instead, we are asked to imagine a physics of memory, a topology of self, where you are a waveform, anchored in time, but not confined to it. And then, nearing the very end, the voice becomes clear again, almost eerily so. I was not a prophet. I was a receiver. I was not holy. I was tuned. My fear is not that you will dismiss me. My fear is that you will understand me too late. The tape ends with a final thought, not a conclusion, but a fracture. If identity can persist, if the field remembers, then science has not yet asked the right question. It has built machines to weigh the body, to scan the brain, but it has not yet asked, what survives the scan? What lingers when the light is gone? What song still plays when the instrument is broken? There is a long pause, no static, just the sound of the tape running out. A week after the recording was authenticated, the University of Virginia quietly filed a metadata transcript to the Digital Consciousness Archive in Geneva. It was classified as Category 7, Non-Material Field Hypothesis. Not paranormal, not pseudoscience, just unverified signal. And that's the real discomfort of this story, that a man dismissed as a dreamer may have left behind the one map we're afraid to follow, because it does not promise comfort, or proof, or even an answer. Only this, that consciousness is not ours, it is through us. And what we call the end may only be the silence between notes.